Hello and welcome to The Way Talk. I'm Roland, and this is a show about the early church. Our goal is to rediscover the early Jesus movement and live out its life and practices in our time and culture. The last talk was on community. This talk is a follow-up on that subject. It concerns the concept of house churches. What about them? Are they legitimate? Can they really be considered churches? I think so, but first, some clarification is in order. Church is not a building, at least not a physical one. Church is a people in Christ. It's unfortunate that we got stuck with the word church because it so easily conjures up in people's mind a building with a steeple and pews. Now, I have nothing against a building with a steeple and pews, or chairs for that matter. It's just that we shouldn't envision that when we think of church. We should instead envision a people in Christ when we think of church. The Greek word is ekklesia. It's composed of two Greek words, ek, which means out from, and kaleo, which means to call. The Greek word ekklesia therefore refers to called out ones. By the way, do you know that the word ekklesia in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures, is used to refer to the Israelites at Sinai? The King James Version reflects this in calling that Israelite congregation the church in Acts 7:38. The quote-unquote church then has been around much longer than most of us thought. Well, as I said, the Greek word ekklesia refers to called out ones. Its proper translation is assembly or congregation. Why? Well, probably because the words assembly or congregation actually bring to mind a gathered people. Anyway, what's important here is that church is not a building. Church is a people in Christ. All right then, what about house churches? Are they legitimate? Can they really be considered churches? I think so for one simple reason. Churches meeting in homes was the normative New Testament practice. In Acts 2, the disciples met at the temple. Later we're told that Solomon's portico. And they also met daily in their homes. It's been pointed out that this might be biblical precedent for having larger gatherings on a specific day, like Sunday, and smaller home gatherings throughout the week. Most traditional type churches structure themselves in a similar way, so perhaps this viewing is an encouragement. As we move along in Acts, we find the church gathering in various places. For example, in Acts 12, they're in Mary's home, Mark's mother. In Acts 19, they're in the Hall of Tyrannus. Perhaps this is biblical precedent for meeting in buildings and rented spaces. In Acts 23, they're in an unknown third-story room, very likely someone's home. And in Acts 28, they're in a jail cell. Technically, only Paul is mentioned there, but he is teaching all who come to him, and presumably disciples are being made and are returning for study and prayer and the like. Now, some might hear of these Acts locations and see them merely as temporary meeting locations and not actual church worship gatherings. They'd point to Paul's specifically named churches in his letters instead. For instance, in Paul's letter to Philemon, he greets the church in his house. See verse 2. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, really his second letter, see chapter 5 and verse 9 about that, he mentions the church in Aquila's and Prisca's house. See chapter 16 and verse 5. And in Paul's letter to the Colossians, he refers to the church in Nympha's house. See chapter 4 and verse 15. To these references, some might respond, that's exactly it. The normative New Testament practice was to meet in homes. Unfortunately, there's developed something of a divide between those who prefer meeting in church buildings and those who prefer meeting in homes. The former might refer to the latter as glorified Bible studies, and the latter might refer to the former as stale steeplehouses. It's not my desire to widen the rift. I prefer there to be none. But just as there are advantages to meeting in church buildings, there are also advantages to meeting in homes. I'd like to briefly touch on two of them and then leave you, if you're so inclined, to further search out house churches for yourself. First, there's a financial advantage to meeting in homes. There are no necessary land or building purchases or new construction costs or additions or remodels, etc. These expenses can easily meet and exceed costs of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and these debts put burdens on church attenders who will be responsible to pay off church loans. Now, not all churches have such debts. When I pastored a church in Northern California, we didn't, and thank God. To be honest though, and here's some of my personal opinion, I think it's a tremendous misuse of God's money to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on church building projects and expansions and the like? Why not rather invest that money in missionary work? Why not rather invest that money feeding the poor? It seems to me that we have enough church buildings and that money could be more wisely stewarded if deposited elsewhere. Anyhow, it seems obvious that there are enormous financial upsides to meeting homes. Again, there are no land or building costs, nor are there additional expenses to keep the church buildings open, like insurance, electricity, water, power, waste, etc. Second, there's a relational advantage to meeting homes. Now, this advantage is more subjective than the previous one, so I'll admit that right off the bat. But it seems to me that a home environment is more personal and allows for more open and intimate exchanges and fellowship. Now, I'm not suggesting that this can't be had inside a church building. You can have a time of singing and teaching followed by fellowship and food. We did that, and many traditional churches do. It just seems to me, there I go with my feelings again, that a home environment is more personal and does allow for more open and intimate exchange and fellowship. All right, now it's your turn, if you so choose, to further search out house churches for yourself. Until the next talk, grace and peace to you.